Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to not my room, guys. This is actually a little office that I have at my dad's place. I think some of you might have thought that I was back to Ireland at this stage, given the shifts in the scenery and my videos recently. But this is because I'm operating with a backlog of videos that I'm also releasing that I recorded prior to Christmas. I did that because, well, there are times when I'm not able to make videos at the moment, so I'm using the backlog to make sure that I keep releasing at the usual times so that, you know, I don't leave you starving. So at the moment I'm at my dad's place and I'm standing, which is an interesting new sort of parameter. So we'll see how that works. In this video, I want to return to some typing systems that I've been discussing in some quick critique videos that I made in the last couple of weeks. And there's been some interesting reactions to my mentions of C.S. Joseph, of objective personality, of voltology, typing by microexpressions, and so on. Now, the topic of Frank James is an interesting one as well. It's not technically speaking you know, a typology system. It's more an entertainer. But again, these are like comments on the sort of, what could you call them? Like popular culture, popular personality culture, you know, comments on what's going on. And it seems that it's stimulating discussion, some positive, some less positive, but at least it's stimulating discussion, and that's always a positive. So I find it stimulating to continue in that vein, at least part of the time. Now, before I move on for further explorations of these questions, don't forget that you have this marvelous book that I have penned, available on Amazon. In the description box below, you have all the links to the Amazon website for any, you know, location in the world, more or less. If your location is not available, just drop me a comment and I'll get back to you. You can see Manifesto of Jungian Existentialism, a concept with which some of you are now familiar. It's a very lovely addition to your library. It's less than $10, paperback ebook format. So do yourself a kindness and consider buying the most in-depth investigation of the INFJ personality ever published. So, there's been, like I said, some interesting reactions to some of my recent quick critiques. So, like I said, in order, I could talk about C.S. Joseph, return to C.S. Joseph briefly, objective personality as well. I think I should touch on briefly, and maybe typology in general, some broad comments on typology, motivated by comments as well. So this is partly a way of responding to comments. So thank you to the people who've been commenting on my material, because it's always inspiring me to comment back and keep the conversation going. Now, if I have a bit of time, I might drop one more remark, maybe about Frank James or not. We'll see. If it's to be purely gratuitous, then I won't do it. But if it's to be more than just gratuitous, then I might just do it. Right. So the reactions to my, it has to be admitted, somewhat dismissive discussion of C.S. Joseph have sparked, I'd say, mostly positive comments from people who agree. So insofar as there's agreement in that department, I guess there's not a lot more that I could say. But there's also some people who were a little bit irked, as I had expected, who thought that I had been a little bit unfair and maybe a little bit biased in my discussion of C.S. Joseph's framework. Now, in fairness to the people who commented, the comments were not dismissive in the sense that they were saying I didn't understand anything, that it was full of shit or anything like that. It was mostly quite, you know, constructive criticism, constructive engagement. And for this reason, I like to return to some of the points that they had made. So now, one of the points that I think is important to return to is the point that essentially said this. They said, well, C.S. Joseph might not be pure science. His framework might not be pure science, but psychology isn't science. We know that psychology is pseudoscience anyway, so why have a fixation on C.S. Joseph, basically? And why not take into account the more positive aspects of his contributions, such as the type grid and his systematization of John Beebe's work and so on and so forth. So in answer to this, what I would say is, I think it's correct to appreciate whatever C.S. Joseph is contributing in and of itself. As a theoretical, speculative contribution to the field of personality theory, if this is helping you, I mean, I think this is great. But you see, there's a difference between speculative work, including advanced and systematized, but nevertheless speculative work, and offering a typing service, very expensive typing service. I want to remind you of that. I haven't checked recently, but at some point in the past, a half-an-hour session, typing session with C.S. Joseph was $500. I mean, who in their right mind would spend that much money? I mean, if you have that much money to spend, just go and contact a local psychotherapist, qualified psychotherapist, and do a journey of self-exploration with them. You know, why would you spend just fortune, half an hour with someone who doesn't have any qualifications? And I know that that doesn't mean that what they're doing is, you know, but it's obviously, there's a bit of an issue there, you see. So the quantitative question of how much it costs is not negligible. That's why I think that there's the real question to be asked here. So you see, it's the combination of this absence of scientific, not so much scientific rigor, because the notion of rigor is always going to be something that's debatable, that's subject to interpretation. It's just absence of scientificity in the strict sense, that is an absence of falsifiability. If a model is not falsifiable, then it's not scientific. It's the Popperian line that I take. You may take another line, but I think it's a pretty consistent one, at least. So, you know, it'd be interesting to exchange with you further on whether the scientificity criterion should be something else than Karl Popper's. And there's been other criterions. So, you know, I'm all for having a discussion on the best one. I think the Karl Popper falsifiability criterion is in many ways the most agile, flexible, simple, elegant, and reliable one, which is why I use it. Can you falsify a model? Can a model be proven to be inaccurate? Maybe not wholly, but at least partly. If this is not the case, then it's pseudoscientific. It's true that a lot of pseudoscience is interesting, and pseudoscience, although it has a bad name, is actually a neutral word, originally speaking. It's purely a descriptive word. It means that whatever discipline we're talking about falls short of actual predictive, measurable, repeatable science. But it can be extremely interesting. Theology, metaphysics, most of what I'm interested in, I would say 95% of what I'm interested in, what I do, qualifies as pseudoscience. So there's not a problem with it. But to charge people with insane amounts on the basis of, or at least on an implied basis of something that's more scientific than it really is, that's what the issue is. Pseudoscience is nothing wrong with it. It's what's around it, the context around it, that can become an issue. You see, so I'm not saying that as pseudoscience, what C.S. Joseph does is to be completely deemed worthless. I'm saying it's not scientific, and the fact that it's not falsifiable is a real issue when it comes to a typing service. Now, there's a lot of different dimensions to why it's an issue. First of all, it's an issue because there's a convergence of interests between a business and a model. If the business is the model and the model is the business, then the business can only thrive if the model thrives. And the model thrives by claiming it's always accurate, you see? So of course it cannot be impartial. Impartiality being one of the fundamental tenets of a scientific model. Like, if you cannot see this most basic fact, either it's that you're willing to see through it or see past it, and you're willing to see past it and you're aware of all the complications involved, and then, you know, it's your choice. But if you can't see it, just make an effort and notice just how slippery this notion is when your model is your business. That's obviously going to be an issue with falsifiability, because the concern of the business owner is going to be that as the modeler, they're not going to be willing to admit that their model can be wrong, because they're going to perceive an admission that it can be wrong as a potential threat on the viability of the business. And that's a massive issue when you're trusting someone to give you an accurate analysis of your type. Right? Please consider this for a second, because this is of absolutely fundamental importance. Now, as regards objective personality, I just want to briefly mention that some of what I had said in my last video on the topic, where they were discussed for a brief while, was not completely accurate, and that my opinion has evolved since then. In fact, that video that was released, it was released yesterday, but I think that was it released? Well, it was released 2 days ago as I'm speaking now, but by the time this video comes out, it might have been a few weeks. You know, I don't exactly know when I will release this specific video, but certainly I have, you know, I portrayed OPS in a manner that was just not completely accurate, and I have to be honest. Now, the main issue that not with the model itself, but with my assessment of it, is that, and it's quite an important one, it's quite a serious one, so it really has to be mentioned, and a mea culpa to come with it, is that I portrayed it as if it has, you know, if it incorporated an 8 function model, purporting to give it an analysis description of the use of the 8 functions, that is incorporating the so-called shadow functions, or as I like to call them sometimes, the pseudoscience function, because incorporating the shadow functions is descriptively very interesting when it comes to a scientific model. It's a straight path into pseudoscience. So, you know, it's not true that OPS incorporates this model. They have a 4-function model. It's a little bit confusing because in their terminology, they use the concept of daemon to refer to a function that's actually part of the 4-function stack, rather than as in the John Beebe nomenclature and the C.S. Joseph nomenclature and other nomenclatures. Daemon function usually refers to the function in the 8th slot. So that's a shadow function, in other words, a pseudoscience function, but it is not a pseudoscience function in the OPS. So OPS, as far as I can tell, now that this has been removed, of course, there are still, you know, issues with claiming that they are using the scientific method, whereas a more accurate description of the situation is that they're aiming toward a scientific method. But the very idea that they are concerned with this scientific method, the very idea that they are trying to strive towards it, and in fact have incorporated by little this notion of a statistical strength of a particular verdict. That is, that they would give you a certain type with only a certain percentage of certainty. These are massive leaps toward achieving a trustworthy scientific model. So my reservations are a lot less clear now, a lot less pronounced now than they appear to be in my last video on objective personality. So honestly, I have not purchased the services, and I would be lying if I said that I had completely expert knowledge of what they do. And like I said, there are some slight issues, maybe not so much issues, there are nomenclature issues with the use of certain functions, and I don't agree with everything when it comes to the concepts of, you know, jumper and blast and so on. But there is a real attempt there to move towards something that is more scientific than most things that you can find online. So that was for my mea culpa. And you know what? Oh yeah, so I'm not going to talk about Frank James. Sorry if I created some hopes in you. I don't know what the equivalent of clickbait is for YouTube videos. I guess it's clickbait as well, but I avoided the clickbait in this case. Just to finish with some specific, or no, rather opposite of specific comments about the field of personality theory, personality models, personality as a science. Can it become a science? Is psychology really all non-science or pseudoscience, etc., etc.? Well, as frameworks like OPS exemplify, it is not true that personality modeling has to remain pseudoscientific. It's a wrong argument to consider that because pretty much the entire history of personality theory so far has been one of pseudoscientific status. It's obviously wrong to think that this is bound to remain the case. The future is not dictated necessarily by the past. And in fact, most of the sciences which we accept today to be completely clearly sciences used to be pseudosciences back at the time of the Greeks, for example, and before the Greeks. So, you know, usually the career is to begin as a pseudoscience and then, well, either to remain as a respectable pseudoscience or to move toward the path of a science in a more mature stage of development. And that's, you know, I think that is definitely something that's open to the field of personality theory. Now, does that mean that once that is attained, the merits of a more pseudoscientific, descriptive, mythological approach to personality, like the one, you know, sketched in, or the one developed in Jung and Beam and followers, you know, has been thriving for a while? No, I mean, like, this will remain extremely important, again, because pseudoscience does not have, it's not a pejorative word, at least when I use it. I use it in just the literal sense. You know, it's just not quite science. But a lot of pseudoscience is, in my opinion, more useful, more interesting than science. Remember, if the criterion for scientificity is the falsifiability criterion of Karl Popper, you know, that tells us nothing about whether a particular scientific model or theory is interesting. And it also tells us nothing about whether a pseudoscientific theory or model is interesting. The pseudoscientific equivalent might be much more interesting, more descriptively rich, and so on, you know. And like I said, I want to be completely honest, this technically qualifies as pseudoscience. It's not a scientific work. It's an investigative, philosophical, existential work. I claim it's good, but, you know, it is pseudoscience. So again, not an insult necessarily. It depends what you do with it. Finally, it is simply not true that all psychology is pseudoscience. I mean, you know, any psychologist nowadays, clinical psychologists, researching psychologists in universities, they proceed mostly, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, by means of experimental work. So it is falsifiable, it is falsified, and it's certainly scientific. So that argument doesn't hold. Now, that's kind of all I wanted to say. Don't forget that you can support me on Patreon. The link will be down there, and that you can get this nice book, The Ecstatic Soul. Would you like to be an ecstatic soul? Would you like to be a Jungian existentialist? If you support me on Patreon, or if you get this book, or both, you are bound to become one and to be a very good friend and a great supporter. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you soon, guys. Bye-bye.